Hey, everybody, it's Dean Meadows with the Daily Apologist, and it is the Daily Apologist podcast. I am super excited to not only have started this series, but to continue this series called When the YouTube Atheist Comes to Town, as we talk about background, arguments for and against God, and ask the question, what would it take for the YouTube atheist that comes to town to be a Christian, to be a Christian or to be a Christian again? And with me today is a guy that I have never actually sat down and talked to one-on-one. We certainly have had some, how should I say it, interesting conversations before online. It's Jim Barrows from the Atheist Community of Austin. He joins us for the show today. Jim, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing pretty good. It's Saturday, no complaints. So, talking about one of my favorite subjects.
Awesome. So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. What is, let me pull this down real quick. What is your specific background? Your upbringing, and how did you, if you were a Christian, then how did you what was the process of moving towards atheism?
So, I grew up Catholic. My dad was in the Air Force, moved 14 times in 17 years before we stopped counting. I've moved a couple more times than my family has. During that entire time, I was either enrolled in CCD, and I don't remember what CCD stands for, but it's basically Catholic education. Happens once or twice a week, depending on parish and other things. Or I was enrolled in Catholic school. One of those two things for all the way up through start of high school. And first 2 years of high school were actually the Catholic high school called Mount St. Michael's. And then the last 2 years were at a public school. So, we went to church every Sunday. And then every holy day, and before we would go on a trip, we'd say the rosary. Um, so we were religious. Wouldn't say we were super religious by any stretch by what I now consider the standard for super religious.
Okay, so you would say you were more, growing up. Would you say that you were more like, as far as attendance or anything like that? Like were you nominal in that, or seasonal, or
No,
was it
we went every Sunday.
every Sunday? Okay, so every Sunday
Well,
you were at
so as a
mass.
Catholic, Catholics, we can go Saturday evening.
Oh,
So,
okay.
but we went to mass every week,
Okay.
either on Saturday or on Sunday. And like I said, every holy day, whether it fell on a Saturday or Sunday or not. My parents were always active in the parish. Like I said, we generally went to school at the parish. So we were constantly, active, constantly being educated, constantly going through all of that. But I mean, we weren't there's that. In terms of other Christians go, we were pretty mild, but we were
Okay.
still fairly active. So, I would consider most evangelicals, like what Matt went through and what
Mm-hmm.
V's gone through and things like that, to be the extreme.
Okay.
I'm very mild compared to that.
Okay.
But like I said, we always went. No matter what state we were in, if we were traveling, didn't matter.
Yeah.
We'd do vacation. Sunday would roll around. We found the local parish and went.
Okay.
Um,
Well,
so
that's certainly interesting. I've actually, one of the things that I actually do want to study more at some point down the line, once I figure out everything else that I want to study, is I'd love to study more on Catholic doctrine. So I appreciate you, number one, before we go any further, coming on the show and
yeah,
having a friendly conversation. To where we can kind of just show people that just because we disagree on, some of the bigger things in life, that we can still have a friendly conversation. So thanks
oh
for
yeah,
that. So growing up, people could easily grow up in a situation where their family is super religious, but it never really takes for them. There's never that moment of, genuine accepting it, either for yourself or just having that moment of clarity of, this is what I believe, and and I'm going to follow this. How would you describe that for you? Was there a moment where you said, okay, all in here on the Catholic Christian thing? Or was it one of those things where, hey, I know that we go every Sunday and I know that my parents are heavily involved, but I got to tell you, this just seems either not for me or there's just something fishy about this.
Well, so I should probably go into a little bit more background.
Okay.
I have attention deficit disorder and a fairly severe version of it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I didn't have a severe version of the hyperactivity that usually is a component of ADD, but I did have some of it. So there was a lot of things about school, regardless of whether it was secular or religious, that never really sat well with me. I don't do well in talking head type situations for class and education.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Elaborate on that.
so,
What do you mean by talking head type class and education?
teacher led education,
Okay, gotcha.
instructor led. I don't do really well in those situations. Now that I didn't find out I had ADD until I was an adult, right? And so I'm 50 years old. So we're talking. I did high school in the late 80s, so grade school was the 70s through
Okay.
the 80s. Um, and so there was no ADD diagnosis at the time that I'm aware of, until the late 80s at the best. And so at about 23, 24, my mom figured it out. She said, "Hey, I want you to look at this checklist." And I was like, "Okay, fine, mom." And I checked almost every box on the list.
Mm.
And that was the ADD checklist. My parents checked every box on the list. And so that's how I found out that I had it. But I read really, really well. Like
Mm-hmm.
most ADD, I can hyper focus on a couple of things. And the word is hyper focus. It's not an exaggeration. And
Yeah.
most ADD people have something they can hyper focus on. It's what makes dealing with us so hard. Because the common refrain is you could really focus if you want to, like you do when you read. And
Yeah.
the answer to that question is no, I can't.
Gotcha.
So my problems with school, and with education, and in fact with mass, all probably stem from ADD more than a belief or disbelief.
Okay.
Mass was always very boring to me, until I got old enough to actually kind of understand some of the symbology.
Mm-hmm.
Catholicism is huge on symbology. When you start with in a period of time when nobody read, you can't rely on books to get your point across. You have to rely on symbology. You have to rely on stories. So the Catholic Church is huge on that just by tradition. So when I started to understand it, sometimes it would make things more interesting. Most of the time, like the homilies, don't ever ask me to remember one. I won't.
Okay.
And I couldn't at the time because they were preaching, and I still have a problem with that, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
If you ever see me get super short on with somebody on AXP, it's probably because they were preaching, and that just really annoys me, because I can't concentrate long enough to really focus on it. So a lot of that could be that. But as a kid, I read through the Bible all the way through it. I never remember questioning a whole heck of a lot. My first real negative experience was with a nun, of course. And I just had a negative educational experience with her to begin with. My first negative impact with her was in a math class. She was teaching math. Um, and she insisted that I knew how to do something, and I had never been taught it. So she called me up to the blackboard, and I dug my feet in and refused to do anything because I didn't know how to do it. So I wasn't even going to try. She calls my mom and finds out I didn't have to do it. That's the relationship we had.
Mm.
She starts marking me off in religion class for, we had to memorize these lines at the end of every chapter. And I would change the word, but not the meaning. Because I was reading at high school level. This is grade school at the
Yeah.
time. So I didn't change the meaning, and I was close enough. So what the heck? That was my first negative experience. But it didn't really cause me to disbelieve. It just was like, this is BS. I don't need any of this. So I stopped paying attention, and those grades slid quite a bit. But yeah, no, I never really started to question until I became an adult. I realized that I kind of wanted to get deeper into things, so I bought Catechism of the Catholic Church, which is a great big thick book about like this. I usually have one hanging around somewhere. I don't see it off the top of my head. I should have grabbed it. which is everything the Catholics believe. It basically walks through the profession of faith,
Mm-hmm.
the Our Father, Hail Mary, and one other thing. And then explains why we believe what we believe, goes through the whole Catholic doctrine in that. So if you want to go check it out, that is actually a really good place if you just want something to skim and look and say, oh, here's profession of faith, because almost every denomination has one, or some, version close enough to it. You can see what the differences are, and also what the Catholic Church says about this. Trying to find anything else in the Catholic Church is entertaining, to say the least, because I've tried a couple of times. It's a 2,000-year-old organization. Went back when they didn't have things really well done, so trying to find stuff. Well, I tried. I know the Catholic Church at one point had trouble with people committing suicide because they go to confession and then commit suicide because they had no sins. They'd go straight to heaven. That's where they wanted to be. And I couldn't actually find where the Catholic Church did something about it directly. In 2,000 years of history, I couldn't pinpoint that, and I know I heard it somewhere, but who knows?
So I do have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You said you started questioning, when you were an adult. At what age was that? Was that early adulthood? Middle adulthood?
20s, 30s,
20s,
somewhere in
30s?
there.
Okay.
I started getting into Catholic apologetics, and looking at what they were talking about and what the arguments were. Getting into Catholic history, which is really European history for right up until the Reformation and all that. And just that's where I started to actually kind of go, now wait a minute, there's some problems here.
Yeah. So sorry, I don't mean to cut you off.
No,
so like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not super involved, maybe mildly convinced that this is, objectively absolutely true, and 10 being sign me up to, be a priest, right? And that this is all true, absolutely, totally true. And you couldn't convince me otherwise. Where were you kind of on that, arbitrary scale that I just made up?
So 8 to 9 most of the time. It would never have been a 10 if 10 is wanted to be a priest, because I like women and thought at the time up until my 30s that I wanted a family. Mm-hmm. So a priest was never an option because of that.
Yeah.
If they had eliminated that, that was a possibility. Deacon was a possibility, which is kind of a lay priest, for lack of a better word, without actually looking up what a deacon actually is. But anyway, because I have forgotten over the years. But yeah, getting more involved that way. Right up until I started looking at the apologetics. I started looking at what the arguments were, looking at the history of the Catholic Church. And, like I said, the history of the Catholic Church up to the Reformation is the history of Europe. It's also the history of Christianity. So, because it's either big C or little c, depending on when you're looking at it, right?
Yeah. I would say if we had another Protestant on the call, he or she would probably say little c for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, like, when you first started to doubt, what was it, doubting the whole enterprise of Christianity, or did you just see some inconsistencies with Catholicism? Because you could see inconsistencies with Catholicism but not necessarily give up the whole enterprise of Christianity.
I started to see inconsistencies with the story of the Bible and the story of Catholicism itself. My biggest question is kind of, why does God need to convert people to the point of a sword? And broad brushing, that is kind of the history of the Catholic Church. Whether you're talking about the conquistadors in South America, whether you're talking about proselytizing up in Northern Europe, there was a lot of at the point of a sword type stuff
Mm-hmm.
going on. It's like, well, wait, if your arguments are good, and if being Catholic is so much better, then you would see that without the need of a sword.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start looking at like the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, especially the early Renaissance, what you see is that despite the Catholic Church's best efforts, society is beginning to progress rapidly and
Mm-hmm.
has continued since then, despite, in many cases, being directly opposed to the Catholic Church. So the question then became for me is why?
Mm-hmm.
And that still is a really large question, is almost all the progress we've made as humanity has come despite what the Bible and Christianity says should be happening, in many ways. And so that kind of started it. I've always had a degree of logic behind me. I mean, I've been programming since I was a mid-teenager. I started on Trash 80s.
Mm-hmm.
So logic in many ways is really near and dear to my heart. There were a lot of really bad arguments that just made no sense.
Hold on 1 second, Paul.
The Renaissance happened, starts in Italy. One could make the claim that it starts in direct opposition to the Catholic Church. A bunch of people going, "Hey, this guy is no more holy than the rest of us."
Mm-hmm.
Again, we're painting with broad brushes here. We're not getting into the nitty
Yeah.
gritty. There's always more than one reason when we look at history. But yeah, I just started looking at all that, and it's kind of like, well, maybe not. Like I said, the logic, the reasoning just seems severely flawed. And it kind of just snowballed from there in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
I started getting into my profession as a software engineer more too, especially around the question of estimation. Because one of the things we don't do well in the software engineering community is estimate how long a project is going to take.
Well, you're engineers.
But mechanical engineers and double E's and other engineers do better than we do as software engineers.
Gotcha.
And that started getting me more into the mind and how the mind works and how we actually do stuff. And it was shortly after those two kind of things started to gel in my head that I kind of went, you know what? Let's see what other people say. And then I found AXP and I found the other YouTube apologists. And
so, if you don't mind me asking, how long have you been an atheist?
Probably since my late 30s, early 40s.
So, how long have you been an atheist?
Since my late 30s, early 40s, and I'm mid 50s now. So
Okay.
10 or 15 years, maybe a little bit longer.
So
I don't have an exact moment when I went, aha, I'm an atheist.
Gotcha.
It was a long slide, multiple channels that kind of got me there.
So how influential, you're not the first guest that we've had that has said that AXP was influential in their, moving into the atheist camp. How influential was AXP in your deconversion from Catholicism?
It was definitely the nail in the coffin.
It was?
Yeah. I was already, that's what kind of convinced me that saying I was an atheist was okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that being an atheist would be okay. It was also kind of my first exposure to the word atheist.
Yeah.
I didn't really have a label for it. I just knew I didn't believe anymore, didn't accept anything that the Catholic Church or any Christian church said. And they kind of put that final nail in the coffin. And being on the show and all that is what keeps me looking at all of this stuff,
mm-hmm.
still looking for the answer to the question, is there a God? And my position is I don't know. I don't see enough evidence to convince me that there is one at the moment. Please provide evidence. And we've talked enough that that's my favorite thing is either prove it or give me evidence, right? Those are my two favorite lines.
It's maybe that's one of the things that I would want to ask. I've got other questions about your deconversion first, because I do want to at some point talk about the idea of I don't know and how that correlates to atheism. So when you deconverted and you said you had this experience with AXP and
Mm-hmm.
that was kind of the nail in the coffin. And if I'm getting too personal, you can tell me that you don't want to answer. So your parents know about that?
So I have not been able to figure out a way to tell my parents that I'm an atheist
Mm-hmm.
that won't actually um, make my mom have a really bad experience with that. And
Yeah.
then my dad will follow, and things will go hairy from there with the possible disownership of me and
Yeah.
all kinds of negative stuff.
Man,
So I'm not out to them, but if they were to ever join any social media, I mean, they'll
it'd
find
be
out
pretty
in 10
clear.
seconds.
It'd
Yeah.
be pretty clear.
So
Man,
I'm not hiding. I'm not bringing it up because, like I said, I don't want to cause them any harm. This is
yeah.
not their fault.
Yeah.
My mom will blame herself. She'll blame everything else, and there's no way that I've been able to figure out to do this in a way that won't
That's
actually cause a whole
that's
bunch
one
of
of the
pain.
things. That's one of the things as I look at my uh, friends who are atheists, but their parents don't know about it. I can't even begin to imagine um, what that's like. That's got to be one of the I'm even struggling to form words with regards to it. It has to be one of the toughest things that anybody can do because on one hand, you know, you have come to this point in your life where this is a sincere position that you have arrived at. But then on the other hand, as much as you want to tell people about it and want to ask people questions about, their faith, you've got people who you obviously hold near and dear to your heart who are close to you, who you love, and knowing that if you were to do that, that they would be devastated and there would be these circumstances and situations that wouldn't, as you've said, wouldn't necessarily be advantageous. So I guess my question would be to follow up on that is um, from someone who has never experienced that or dealt with that, how how do you navigate that range of emotions, right?
Well, fortunately, I have enough topics of conversation with my parents that I never have to bring it up. If they ask me to go to mass, I will. They don't typically.
Mm-hmm.
They know that I'm not super active in the church anymore. Um, but we have so many other things to talk about, and I never bring it up.
Yeah.
And in fact, the only time that I really talk about atheism is on AXP when I'm around other atheists and we're, having a bitch session about Christians and things going on in politics and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and then on Facebook when I decide to actually, make a comment somewhere. But honestly, that's probably 20%
You
of my
would make a
life.
comment on Facebook?
On occasion, I do.
No,
On occasion, I just get bored and stop.
I
Um,
gotcha. No,
but
that's
yeah,
fine. Okay. Well,
and I try not to. I mean, like I feel like I can with you a little bit more,
mm-hmm.
but I also try not to do it too often because it is your page, your space. You can say whatever you want. You
Yeah.
shouldn't feel like, oh, what's Jim going to respond to this time?
Well, I
Um,
I certainly give you license to comment whenever you want on my page. I thoroughly enjoy those conversations. Those are man,
right.
those are
Yeah.
those are big conversations. They're important conversations, and I don't know about you, but I approach it as if I can formulate a argument or produce evidence that will move Jim's needle more towards theism, that's cool. But I really think when we have these types of dialogues, um, I hope that other people see those dialogues so that maybe if they've never been exposed, if they're an atheist and never have been exposed to maybe the more rigorous aspects of uh, Christian philosophy, or maybe if it's a Christian that's never been exposed to, counter arguments to Christianity, that they see that and that they can at least begin to have that internal conversation and journey within themselves. I think that's so important because I think one thing that you and I will both agree on is that far too often in the society that we live in, people simply believe a lot of things for very bad reasons.
Yes.
Even
Yes.
even for me, one of the things that drives me, up the wall, with the Christian community is when you ask a lot of Christians, why do you believe what you believe? They say, well, I was either raised in it or because that's just kind of what mom and dad taught me. And after that, there's really no,
There's no
further
there.
investigation. And
Yeah.
I'll put my cards out on the table. I think that's a reason why a lot of younger people are leaving Christianity is because their parents never really did serious investigation. And then
Well,
and plus they're good arguments. They're good counter arguments
mm,
that atheists bring to the table. But you've got a group of young people who, their parents never talked to them about it, never exposed them to it, and so they never really um, get exposed to the other side of the house um, until later in life. And I think personally, this is just my 2 cents, and
yeah.
I don't know, I might be a little biased here, but I think if the Christian community did a better job of having the type of dialogue that you and I are having, um, we would be better able to give better answers than what we give, to
Yeah.
a large
Well,
degree.
well, I will disagree with you slightly. I won't disagree. I'll add what I also think, because I don't necessarily disagree with what you just said about not having good faith. But I think that the reason why it's so important now, or why this is happening, is because of access to information. When you have Eric Hovind, I forget what his father's first name is, but when you
Kent
have the
Hovind.
Kent, yeah, Kent and Eric saying the exact same thing 20 years apart,
Mm-hmm.
quoting the exact same science, when in the last 20 years we have advanced every area of knowledge so far beyond what they talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes you all of 30 seconds to find that when they start talking about dating rocks, they're outdated. Their information is outdated. And it's like, no, it's no longer just these 4 or 5 things. It's these 15, 20, whatever the number is. It's more. We have more ways. We understand how the old ways don't work as well. And so we can compensate for those. So anytime that a young earth creationist, and I'll pick on those in particular, decides to open her mouth on science, it's so easy to debunk them today. And you don't just go and find articles anymore. You can go find articles on Scientific American and other peer-reviewed journals, but you can actually find the research paper itself.
I'll no, I mean, I'll just go ahead and say it. Young Earth creationism is not my forte, nor is it my specialty. So maybe one of the things that I'll do is I'll get a Young Earth creationist on here and play them this clip, and then at some point, you and the Young Earth creationists come back on and have a dialogue. If you're open
Actually,
for it.
get Vice Rhino or Paulogia to do that. They are much, much better versed in that, especially Vice Rhino, whose
Gotcha.
name is an anagram for Eric Hovind.
Oh,
So,
I did not know that.
yeah,
Okay.
I didn't know that either until he mentioned it. I forget, on one of his videos, but he is much better able to go deep into the science. His videos are well researched, and most of the time he will tell you where he got his research from. So he, notes where, or he cites his work. He cites where he
Mm-hmm.
got his work, his
Well,
information from.
well, let me before I ask you about good and bad arguments for God. Let me posit this for a
Mm-hmm.
second for the sake of argument. Um, for the sake of argument, and because I don't
Mm-hmm.
even I would even say that I'm a novice when it comes to young Earth creationism. Like I know little to nothing about young Earth creationism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, other than maybe an introductory course when I was at preaching school.
All right.
Say that is all completely bunk, um, and it's a matter of okay, well, what this really is in the first couple chapters of Genesis is some type of mytho historical genre or Hebrew poetry.
Well, so I'm a Catholic.
Would that change?
Yeah. Well, so let me say it. I'm a Roman Catholic, or ex-Roman Catholic, And the I was never taught that the Bible is literally true. So I don't have a problem with Noah's flood. I mean, I never had a problem with Noah's flood being a metaphor, or not being entirely 100% accurate. I never had a problem
So you
with
never
any
had the
part.
problem with, kind of what takes place in some of the. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, no, go ahead.
But so there is this question that comes up every now and then: is this a global flood or a local flood? As an ex-Roman Catholic, that was never even on the table for you.
No, it wasn't. Now, I will say that Catholicism is a huge, Roman Catholicism in particular is huge. And so you may find Catholics who disagree with me.
Mm-hmm.
But I can actually go back and point at doctrine and go point at dogma where the Pope
Okay.
has spoken on the topic. The Catholic Church's official position is that however the universe came about, God did it.
Okay.
So they're okay with that. They're okay with the Bible not being absolutely historically correct. The New Testament
I would have
is,
never known that about Catholicism without you being on the show, Jim.
yeah, it's much more liberal. Um, at the same time, it's also somewhat more conservative. Um, for instance, while several popes have made nice to Protestants and other religions, if I was still a Catholic, I'd still think of you as a heretic because you're not Catholic. um,
Gotcha.
but
That's
and I
the
say that
that's the
somewhat.
first time an atheist has ever said that to me. If I was
Yeah,
still in the Christian camp, I would have thought you, hey, I would have thought you as a heretic. So,
right. And
gotcha.
yeah, I talked earlier about looking for where the church has actually said this is dogma, this is what we believe. And one of the things I went looking for is the Biblio Solamente heresy, which is the Bible only heresy,
Mm-hmm.
which is something I distinctly remember being taught, but I can't actually find a reference for when the Pope issued an encyclical or there was a meeting, and I'll think of the name of it in a minute, probably, or where he has otherwise said and come out with this is dogma, this is doctrine, this is true.
Gotcha.
So this may not be one of those things.
So, sorry, are you going to finish?
No, yeah, but
Okay. So,
yeah,
what is interesting to me is that let if for the sake of argument, and I need to shore up my skills in this area. So for the sake of argument, young Earth creationism isn't true. There's nothing about young Earth creationism being true or not being true that would sway you either way.
no,
Okay.
um, yeah, it's not it's really not a thing for me.
Okay.
It really has to do with what you could reasonably conclude if any version of the God of the Bible were true.
Gotcha.
Um, yeah.
So that leads me into my next question. And this is just standard questions that I'm going to ask
Uh,
every guest. You're the second guest. Had Ethan Michael on last week.
cool.
Um, Understanding that you reject all of the arguments for the
Right.
existence of God in Christianity, which one do you think is like the absolute worst? Which one do you think is the absolute worst?
All of the ontological arguments.
Okay,
All of them.
all of them. So
Because they're all arguments in desperate need of evidence. Um, and I haven't seen a single one where you could even begin to figure out how to test it, how to find evidence for it. And I haven't studied them all,
yeah,
but those as a group are the worst. And
okay.
only because they don't have there, it would be very difficult to find evidence for them,
Well,
from what I've
and
seen.
I guess the point would be of the ontological argument of, beginning with Anselm and kind of ending with not
Hmm.
ending with, but bringing it back into prominence with Plantinga. Is the whole point is that it doesn't require empirical data. It's simply um, a conceptual a priori. It seems to me to be an a priori determination based on logic.
So I agree with that, but to me, it's a lot like fighting over who could win in a fight, Superman or Hulk.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I don't care. I mean, it's fun to argue, but Marvel and DC have completely different physics. The rules of their universes are different.
Mhm.
So first, you got to find some way to make them universal. Then you got to figure out it. We're just arguing to argue, right? And still, that's all it is. It's word games. So I don't disagree with that, but that's why I think they're the weakest, is
Okay.
because that's all they really are word games. And some, to me, of the bunch is the funniest.
It
Uh,
is the funniest.
oh yeah,
Why is
it's
that?
let me see if I can restate it. That God must be the greatest thing of which I can conceive, or something like that.
Hmm.
I can conceive of a better God than the one in the Bible. Period. Every human does. Most Christians are better people than the God of the Bible. So, okay.
So
you
he
know,
would say he's a maximally great being, and so your objection to that would be, well, the God of the Bible is not a maximally great being,
yeah. Let's say the
right?
rats have better morals than humans do. Um,
Do
so
what?
rats have better morals than your God does. Um, actually, you want to have some fun? Google rats and morals. Rats cannot be trained or cannot be rewarded enough to knowingly cause another rat harm, and rats will actually endanger their own lives to free another rat from bondage or from being captured.
Now, is that? Do you think that that's herd morality?
Well, I think it's an argument against God as the moral lawgiver. One of the arguments that I have against that is that, okay, rats have better morals than humans do. Um, and so do most social creatures. I like rats because everybody has this image of rats being very negative, being very very selfish, and actually they're very social creatures. Um, and they do have limits on what they're willing to do. We don't. Human history is filled with examples of that.
You don't think we
But
have any limit on what we would do?
I have not seen a human with a limit to the cruelty. I mean, the humans as a species, as individuals, yeah. I mean,
Okay,
we have
I
done,
was just making sure
yeah,
that we were clarifying there. I was like, because
yeah,
I definitely know that I have limits of the things
yeah,
that I would do.
exactly. But humanity as a whole doesn't seem to. It seems to be capable of doing. I mean, we have experiments showing that people will torture other people just based on an authority figure telling them to do so.
Hmm.
Nothing more than that.
Well,
Uh,
I think you could clearly point to that in recent history. I think as a member of the United States military for 6 years, I think one of the worst things that we could have done, and I'm sure there are people that disagree with me, and that's okay. Um, is what we found out about Abu Ghraib.
yeah. Well,
And
I was in the army for.
I've walked into Abu Ghraib before, so
Uh, I was in the Army for 3 years, right around the first Gulf War. My
gotcha,
dad retired out of the United States Air Force as a colonel. So,
gotcha. Now you've got me a little bit here on the rat thing because I've never even heard of that before. So I guess my question would be, you know, where does and I'm not appealing to God or anything like that.
right,
I'm just
right.
asking on a surface level, how do we know that what rats do is on the basis of a moral reflection and not just instinct? I mean, it seems to me like
I don't know.
in order to do
Yeah,
something morally, you would have to be able to at least think and self-reflect about that decision.
I don't know that they've actually, they may be looking at that.
Mm-hmm.
I just find it interesting that there's a limit on what a creature with that small of a brain and working at probably that instinctual level. I don't really know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, won't actually cause harm. Um, keeping in the same size of critter, there's an article on IFL Science talking about how prairie dogs can communicate and describe a human being in terms of size and shirt color or predominant color on the body
Mm-hmm.
in language. They're speaking and they've broken out what they're all that. Um, so there's a level of communication happening there. I don't know that anyone's done that with rats. So I don't know how much of that comes from a moral versus instinct.
Okay.
Um, but
I
by
mean,
the same
I'd love to
token,
look at it. Um,
I would say this. I would ask the same question about humans.
what about it?
I'd ask the same question about humans. How many humans think about the moral implication of their actions and just act, as opposed to just acting? Even those of us who do talk about morals and ethics on a regular basis.
Hmm.
How much of
Well,
that is instinct versus?
I don't know that I could point to any study that would show it one way or the other, but I do think that if I could show that one person does that and that a rat doesn't have that capability, that there would be this difference between saying something like, you know, rats are more moral than God if in fact rats don't even have the capability of being moral. Right? It's just that okay, their instincts,
Right,
cause
and
these
we're starting
things
to
to
get into
do.
questions of free will and things like that
Sure,
are
sure,
are are
absolutely.
much
Sure,
much
yeah.
more complicated to get
No doubt,
into.
no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Um,
But
but I
I
mean,
just found that interesting. I had never heard
yeah,
that about rats. I didn't even hear that about prairie dogs. I invited the atheist YouTuber onto the show, and I'm getting Discovery Channel stuff here, and that's awesome.
yeah.
I mean, I love watching things about animals. So let me see
Follow
where
IFL Science. It used to be I freaking love science, and it wasn't freaking, but they officially changed the name to
well
IFL
well
Science on Facebook. They're a
thank you for
great
being
channel.
courteous enough not to actually say what they used to call it. I
Out
appreciate
of
that.
courtesy to you, I don't really. It's just a word, and
Gotcha. Um,
language is our itch.
so
So
so so ontological arguments are out.
yes,
They're the weakest on from your vantage point.
uh-huh.
What do you think? Okay, so of all the arguments that you reject for Christianity or for the existence of God, which one do you find the most compelling or convincing? What's the one that if you could scratch your head and go, that seems a little bit convincing, which one would it be?
So it's the one that I actually can't out of hand reject, and that is personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says I had a
Interesting.
personal experience with God, um, I have no way to objectively determine if they did or didn't. I can ask them a lot of questions about, how did you eliminate having a hallucination? How did you eliminate this just being the normal conversation in your head? How did you, there's a lot of things I can ask. How did you
Mm-hmm.
eliminate all these possibilities? But even if they go through and eliminate all those possibilities, it doesn't leave us at an answer as to whether or not they had an experience with a god or gods.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the polytheist community has several people who have claimed to have personal experience with the gods they follow, etc. So it's the one argument I can't reject out of hand.
And you
That
can't reject it because it's a subjective personal experience. Is that what you're saying, or no? Or is it something different?
because it's a personal experience that I can't measure. I can't go back in time in the person's head and put sensors on their head and go, "Are you doing that?"
Yeah.
Um, so we can't do that. Even if we put sensors on the head, I don't know that we have enough understanding of how the human brain works
To
to be
map
able
that.
to definitively say this is a experience with a being external to another human being.
Gotcha.
There's no way I can say that. So I can't reject it out of hand. And if you notice, Matt and I and most of the other hosts, I won't speak for all of them, are usually fairly okay. You had the experience. That
Yeah.
can't
No,
convince me.
that is one thing that I do appreciate about shows like Talk Heathen and the Atheist Experience is that when someone does say, "I had this experience," you guys are very quick to say, "Okay, you had this experience," and then I think you do the right thing in asking, "Okay, well, how do you eliminate the following things?" Right.
Right.
So my follow up question would be then, let's say I came to Jim and I said, Jim, I had this experience um, with God, and you said, okay, I had this experience, and then what are some of the questions that you would ask me, in investigating this experience?
Well, how do you know it wasn't a break with reality? I forget what they call that. How do you know that it wasn't based on a hallucinogen that got into your body? How do you know it wasn't the result of drug combinations? How do how do you know? What did you eliminate?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and honestly, I don't know that I would necessarily dig super hard on that
Yeah.
because, like I said, the answers to the questions don't give me an answer to the question I have, which is how do you know it was real?
Uh-huh.
But we also know that people have complete hallucinations that don't jive with anything we see in reality, and they're completely convinced they exist. And the example I like is the movie Beautiful Mind, which is about a real person. And I think they do a really good job of exposing how that worked in his head,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that I could understand it. How accurate it was, I don't know. But if you're having hallucinations at that level, I can't prove that I'm not the one having the hallucination.
Yeah.
And just because me and five other people don't see the person that person sees, I can't prove that we're not the ones having the hallucination.
So then how could you, I guess my question is, with all the points that you've made with regard to that, how could you, do you think that there's any way to come to some type of definitive answer outside of the
Not yet.
first person experience?
Not yet.
Okay. So
Not
it's
yet.
kind of one of those ones you say, okay, well, I can't, I find this convincing in the sense that I can't overtly reject it because it's a first person subjective experience. And there are all of these questions that we ask, but ultimately, if they might say that they didn't have a hallucination, but I might have been the one that had the hallucination. They might
Right.
say, I did or didn't hear this voice, but it could have been me that did that, or some type of thing.
Yeah. I'm not
Okay.
sensing
Well,
the reality that's
I'll
actually
give
there.
you credit. I'll give you credit, Jim. That is the first, and you might be the only one. And I'd be interesting to see if anybody else, brings this up. I have never heard an atheist ever say, in a roundabout way, uh, I think that the argument from religious experience is the most convincing, and then add the caveat onto it of saying, well, it's only convincing because this is a first person subjective experience that I can't outright just disprove,
Right.
um
Or proof. I can't do
or
either,
prove.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
I'm at I
yeah,
don't know.
yeah.
Right.
No, that's a good point,
Well, and also
there
I
as well.
dodged the question because personal experience isn't really an argument, right?
Well, I mean, there are people that make that argument philosophically, that the religious experience is an actual argument for the existence of God. I haven't
Yeah,
personally looked too much into it to
it's a
comment
soft
one way or the
dodge, but
other, but
yeah, it's a soft dodge, but it's still a dodge. Um,
yeah,
because it is an argument. It is something that we have. It is something that people apparently have.
yeah,
I mean, I've come really close to some people might consider it a mystical experience when I was in the
hmm,
army.
yeah,
Um, where I worked on radars and when I was going through school, um, a friend of mine said, I want to hex our radar. And I was like, okay, cool. And he went, said something and waved his hands. And we went to turn the radar on. It rotated backwards and ground. And we immediately flipped it off, looked at each other and went, huh? Checked everything. Everything looked normal, flipped it back on, and it rotated normally. Never did it again. Um, was that and honestly, when we looked at the math and we did the math, we looked at the electronics, there was no way for current to cause the motors to rotate backwards. So what caused it to rotate backwards? I don't know. Uh,
that was the divine reaching out to you, Jim.
it could be.
Well,
But
here's another follow-up question I have with regards to that. And we talk about, oftentimes we talk about, and this is a big discussion that's going on in the realm of epistemology. How many witnesses does it take, or how many people does it take to have a similar or the same experience to accept their testimony as valid for believing that a certain event took place, or specific argument for God or Christianity to be deemed as sufficient. And I think
yeah,
if there's one area where, um we know, the ins and outs to a large degree about eyewitness testimony. So I guess that's my question. If you had, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out an arbitrary number, 75 people who you knew and trusted, and they came to you and they said, "Hey, we all had, the same experience, together the other day, and it was the voice of God, or we saw, Jesus or something like that." I guess my question is, how many of those types of experiences would need to be reported to you before you said, okay, I know that those are first person subjective experiences, but this seems to be correct on its face?
So it depends on the phenomena they're claiming to have witnessed.
Okay.
75 people coming up and telling me that they saw a storm yesterday when it was completely without clouds. That to me is like, okay, 75 people saw storms that I didn't see. Okay. Weather is highly localized in many cases. I know how thunderstorms work. And yeah, you could have one that was a couple 100 feet wide that was fairly hard to see in a city environment. Okay, cool. I'll believe, I don't know. That I'm willing to accept. That 1,000 people telling me that the sun stopped in the sky. Yeah, I don't care how many people tell me that one, because that raises more questions, right? That is an observance of a phenomena that should be observed and would have ripples
by more than
throughout.
1,000 people.
The number doesn't matter.
Number doesn't matter.
Right?
Okay.
Right. Because if the sun stops in the sky, a couple of things have happened. The Earth has stopped spinning, right?
Yeah.
Or the sun has decided to move opposite of where the way it normally does. So you get the effect that while the sun's moving opposite, you get the effect that it's standing still.
Mm-hmm.
Either of those things happening would create such huge changes in the world and to the universe that they'd be detectable.
It just
Gravity
sounds like
waves.
a bad day.
Yeah, there's no way it works. So it depends. So it depends on the phenomena. If 75 people come and say, "Hey, we heard the voice of God, and He told us this," I'd be like, "Okay, cool. That's a little weird." But I don't know that it would actually go to me believing anything, because hearing a strange voice or hearing voices, one person hearing a strange noise, being convinced it's saying something, and then having 74 other people all jump on board and say that, is something that happens, I won't say regularly, but it's something that happens in the human psyche. And we know this because of the back, I grew up in the 80s. I think you were close to that. The backmasking problems, where people would play heavy metal songs backwards and hear all kinds of things.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody gets convinced. Yeah. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So, okay, that's cool. What did you actually hear? How do you know you actually heard it? Same type of questions. And we end up with, okay.
Yeah.
So it depends on the phenomena that they're observing.
Let me use the illustration that, and I use this with Ethan. It's not original with me. It's actually one that Mike Lacona used when he debated Matt Dillahunty, or roughly around. This is a rough reenactment or restating of the analogy. So you and I are not in the digital world. We're at the Atheist Community of Austin, and you and I are sitting down. We're recording a show. We got a live audience, because you and I like to talk about Kalam and the teleological argument, and they're there, and then all of a sudden someone busts in the room, with a gun, takes us hostage, cuts my head off in front of everybody. And hey, once they do that, the police roll up, and I'm just making this up, and they just run them off out of the building. They chase them down, in Austin, Texas, and then everybody's outside. You've seen me get decapitated, and then you walk outside, and then I come up, and I walk right up to you. I got a scar on my neck, and I recount to you something that one of your loved ones, friends, family members who have passed said to you when you were a little boy, would you accept that as something like a miracle?
It would depend on what uh, investigators would say. We know that regrowing limbs is a possibility. Regrowing a head or reattaching a head's kind of on the extreme end of that. Um, I can think of a number of different ways that you could pull that off. I think a sufficiently skilled magician could pull that illusion off fairly easily. Um, but if we investigated all of that, I'm left with I don't know
Mm-hmm.
as an answer. I don't know how that happened. And congratulations, you're back alive. I'm really happy to see you again.
Yeah.
But to claim that was supernatural, I still need evidence, right? And we don't have any way to test the supernatural. We don't have any way that is reliable enough to know that it works. I mean, we've tested uh, intercessory prayer. Mayo Clinic's done it. A couple other clinics have done it. And intercessory prayer, where you're praying for someone to get healed, works at the same rate of chance. So we don't. So the couple of times we've tried it, I think it's only 3 that we've done it in a modern scientific way. Although there have been a lot more than just as 3 over the years. We don't have any evidence for that.
Well,
so
okay.
I mean, we need a way to reliably say this is a supernatural event before we can start saying things are supernatural.
So a couple of things, a couple of things there. First off, I guess my initial response would be, what more, what other extenuating evidence would you need to suggest that what has just happened to me in that illustration is beyond the natural explanation? I mean, we know that, for instance, decapitated heads don't just reattach themselves to shoulders. We know that we know that in cases of decapitated heads, that the neck area or the limb area, that the shoulders or whatever it is, they don't regrow heads. We know that naturally.
So when you run out of evidence, the only thing you can say is I don't know. And this is one of the problems I have with a lot of apologists, is when they ask this question, the effect of what they're doing is, let's assume that we're, by way of metaphor, we're in a courtroom. Mm-hmm. You're the prosecuting attorney trying to prove that Bob killed Kenny. Mm-hmm. And you go up and you ask the jury, what would it take for you to convict Bob of killing Kenny? Right? That's what you're asking.
Well,
the answer is, show me the evidence, and I'll make the decision.
Right.
So that's the only good answer that I can have. I don't know what evidence would say what supernatural is, and I can't tell you what kind of evidence I'd accept for the supernatural until you can define what the supernatural is. Right? We couldn't answer what the effect of the quantum world, and we still technically can't. But anyway, we can't answer the question, what effect does the quantum world have on the non-quantum world, until we can define what the quantum world looks like, right? Dude, it's the same type of thing.
I thought Ant-Man already crushed that in the Marvel.
Well, yeah, in the Marvel universe, he certainly did.
No,
I don't know about the DC universe.
Yeah, so the reason that I asked that question is not to necessarily bring up the courtroom thing to the jury, but what area does inference to the best explanation play a part in that? I mean, because certainly we know that Dean was dead. Dean got his head cut off. And we know that, hey, Dean is now alive with his head attached to a scar, and he's recounted a conversation between Jim and a loved one that has passed. So it seems like the inference to the best explanation would be, we know that these particular things don't happen in the natural world. So in all probability, this can't be explained naturally. So the inference to the best explanation would be, all right, this may be something that's supernatural.
So as for a conversation I had with a loved one, and that loved one is dead, mediums do this all the time. Um, and people don't really remember conversations super well, and people's memories are usually memories, depending on how many times they've tried to remember an event.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that to me is nothing more than maybe you doing a good cold read or knowing me well enough to be
Without
able to do that, or maybe I told you and I forgot, and
okay,
you
gotcha.
forgot, right? We could both have forgotten, and then you say, "Oh, hey," because that's a recent memory drudged up by the trauma of what you've just been through. Um, that seems to me to be a better inference to the most likely than it is to the supernatural. Because when you try and do that, it should be to the most probable, not the not the possible.
Did I say
Because
possible? I meant probable. I apologize if I
right,
said
yeah.
possible.
I don't actually remember what you said, and I don't think you actually said either word. I'm probably just adding that in there, but it
Okay,
should be the most probable. But in
right.
order to determine probability, we have to know how many times out of how many times something's going to happen.
Yeah, the
And
background
so
information has to be assessed first. Right.
right.
Yeah, no
And we
doubt.
still have no background information on what the supernatural is or how it works or anything about it, right? That's the problem that with the supernaturals, we just don't have
Now,
that.
I don't have the journal article on me, but I believe that somebody has sent me a journal article in which there was a peer-reviewed journal article. I don't remember which medical journal where they documented that a intercessory prayer did work on somebody. Now I'm not.
And
Well,
or
huh?
just one.
Well, I don't know what the document cites. So what I'll do is I wish I had that because I think I that would be a good conversation to have. But I will send it to you, and
Yeah,
I want your feedback on that.
yeah, because I know the Mayo Clinic and a couple other clinics have also done the same thing and have found that it's at the rate of chance across that whole across the spectrum. And that was there's only 3 that were done with double blind experiments that I'm aware of, if I remember correctly.
So
But
I'll see if it meets that criteria as far as what you're talking about, and I'll send it to you. I think that's a very interesting conversation to have. So as much
yeah,
as I want to keep talking, I have one more question for you, and then we've got
okay,
to wrap up the show.
cool.
So go ahead, or did you have something
No,
else
go
you
ahead.
wanted to add?
No.
Okay. So the famous question that I ask V from Talk Heathen over there at the ACA, sorry, excuse me, um, they punish me for this question all the time. I think it's more just annoying than anything else. And I'm going to ask this to every guest, so I'm going to be an equal opportunity
Uh-huh. Go ahead.
annoyer. What evidence or what would it take for you to be a Christian again?
I don't know what specific evidence, because again, present it and let's evaluate it. But it would take actual evidence of the supernatural to actually get me to believe. Or and I look at it this way, it's atheist versus theist. The fact that and under theist you've got the heading polytheist and monotheist, and under monotheist you've got the subcategories of Abrahamic and non-Abrahamic. I'm sure there's others, but anyway, then under Abrahamic you've got Islam, Jew, and that's probably not the right terms, probably Israelite. Anyway, and Christian. And then in Christian, you've got like 1,000 of them or 2,000 of them, whatever the number is. Um, so for me, it would almost be start at that top one, show me the possibility of a theist, that there is a God or gods, which to me would be proof that there's something supernatural out there. And then
Mm-hmm.
work your way down that ladder, that hierarchy. Eliminate the possibility of there being multiple gods and being only one.
Right.
Because the Bible doesn't even do that very well, right? Um, there are
Well,
parts of the Bible where he talks like there's other gods, but whether or not they're actually real or not, you can make the argument. Like I said, it doesn't do it very well, but you can make the other argument. And then as you step down, keep going on down. Um,
Well,
and that would be the start.
couldn't you just say, all right, there's a God, and then jump right to something like the resurrection and say, hey, if the resurrection is a historical event, then there you have it.
If you could prove the resurrection was a supernatural event, certainly.
Yeah.
I could think of a number of different ways that a competent magician, even using the tools of the time, could pull that off. It's not hard to think about different ways that you could actually pull that off
I've actually
without
never
actually
heard
dying.
anybody say that before. You're quite the character, Mr. Jim.
Well, let me put it this way:
Well,
I
I
haven't
like
seen it.
I appreciate
Yeah,
the fact that you think differently than other people.
yeah. I can't see a single miracle that Jesus Christ did that a common stage magician doesn't do in his act at some point in their career. With the exception of the resurrection, that's the only one. Water into wine being done today in India's holy men, trick flagons, bunch of different ways you can do it. But honestly, yeah, nothing in there really says anything to me that, we have preachers today healing people, although they don't seem to be healing COVID people, and churches still have handicap parking. So,
No,
you know,
I'm with you there on the
right.
faith healers, but like it seems like to me like if Jesus was around a crowd of people and like he actually did heal a leper, that would be significant because that's not a inner thing that's taking place, like an inner disease. That's expressly outside, on my hand, on my face, or whatnot.
Right. And so
And I would
if
just
you've
ask,
got,
do you know of any faith healers around? I mean, you're more knowledgeable about that than me. Do you know any faith healers out there in the world that are healing leprosy?
not anymore. Leprosy, as far as I know, is as close to a dead disease as we have.
Right.
Um,
But I
so,
guess
but the way you would do it, right, is if you have sufficient makeup to make it look like somebody is a leper, and then all you really have to do is get the crowd not to see long enough to wipe the makeup off, or whatever it is you're using to simulate the leprosy.
mm-hmm.
I find it interesting that you came up with that because according to the Bible, if I remember correctly, the only thing you really need to do is pigeon's blood and recite what, a magic incantation or something to cure leprosy, according to the Bible.
That might be the Old
It's Old
Testament.
Testament. Yeah, it's Old
I was
Testament.
referencing what Jesus was doing around that time. But
Yeah, I know, but I find the leprosy thing interesting just because, according to the Old Testament, the Bible, you just some pigeon's blood, magic incantation, and you're done, and you're cured of leprosy. Obviously, it doesn't work. Um, but yeah, I can think of a number of ways that Jesus could, in fact, that a stage magician could, in fact, fake doing leprosy. We have faith healers who are healing people who have no legs. Far more impressive things than leprosy.
but don't we know though how they're doing that as far as the stage healers go?
Yeah, and
And
we know
how
how,
would
and like I said, we can figure out how to cure leprosy in the same way that the faith healers are doing it. Like I said, I don't see any miracle that I can't see a modern stage magician do. And given primitive tools and a primitive mindset, one of the problems I think most stage magicians have today is that they have a super skeptical audience who knows how most of the tricks will work.
right.
Um,
So
back
how do you so for something like, Lazarus, right? Confirmed dead and buried,
Confirmed by who?
right?
And how do you know they weren't conspirators?
His immediate family confirms him
Right,
dead,
right.
right?
But again, are they conspirators?
Well,
Does he have a twin brother? And given
there's
the
no it doesn't seem to me there's any historical evidence that would suggest that Lazarus had a twin brother.
right, and you're asking me how it could have been done. And here's a number of ways. One, family's in on it, conspirators. Two, he has a twin brother. Three, he has someone who looks exactly like him, or close enough that can pass for him with just a little bit of makeup. I mean, again, you have a population willing to believe in the supernatural, much more so than today, and far less able to determine reality in terms of special effects and trickery than we do today.
But
I mean,
but you would agree that they didn't if that's the case, then they didn't necessarily have the technology to pull something like that off either, as
I
as consistently or as readily
not
available, right?
not that would pass a modern day person's viewpoint.
So,
Now,
so do you actually think that Lazarus's family was in on it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, like I said, when I look at the miracles Jesus pulled off, and I go, okay, was this supernatural or was this reality? And I can come up with a way to actually pull it off without supernatural means, and the text doesn't give us any help.
Well,
What are you
history
left with?
wouldn't give us any help on that. Wouldn't you need something as far as empirical data, not just the possibility of some conception you make up in your head? Wouldn't you need empirical data to say, all right, here's Lazarus, his family, and this is what happened, and oh yeah, here's a piece
But
of
what's the
evidence
inference
over
to the most
here.
probable?
Here's the evidence over here that historically says that they weren't in on it.
Right.
Right.
But if you look at the story of Lazarus, what's the inference to the most probable?
Well, the inference to the most probable, I think, for me, is if well, there that depends on what background information you take into account, right? With regards to the probability. If the probability is simply, well, miracles are impossible, well then I see your point. But if the background information for the probability includes miracles are possible and Jesus is a historical figure and those other things that go along with that, then it seems to me the most probable thing is that when Jesus said Lazarus come out, Lazarus came out. So
Right.
I think when you and I think you would agree with me that sometimes, maybe not necessarily in this case, but there are cases where the background information that one is willing to accept and not willing to accept can be determined by the
Yes,
worldview that
absolutely.
the person brings to that specific scenario.
Right. And we have to be careful because, for the record, I don't think miracles are impossible. I don't think the supernatural is necessarily impossible.
Okay.
I'm very clearly saying that we have no evidence. We don't have a good enough definition to begin to get evidence,
What
right?
do you mean by that? We
We
don't
need,
have a good enough definition.
well,
I
we
guess
don't
that's
have
one
a good,
question I ask.
if you ask people about different elements of the supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
spirits and ghosts and magic, they have 100 different answers and can't really nail anything down, and 100 different excuses is why their spells don't work. Are any of those excuses valid? I don't know. I just
Mm-hmm.
know the spell didn't work.
I just know the
Um,
spell didn't work. Nice.
right.
Yeah.
If you say you're praying for something to happen and it doesn't happen, is that because God said no or because the prayer didn't work? I don't know. So I'm on the side of I don't know if there's something supernatural. The evidence that we have so far strongly indicates that whatever this, if the supernatural exists, we don't know what it is.
And I think that would be a another point. I guess another, if we're in the courtroom or the Senate or whatever, another point of order would be that. And I'm not trying to be hard on you,
Yeah,
Jim. On one hand, you say, I don't know. We don't have any evidence for the supernatural over here. There are 100 different definitions of it or what people think they experienced that is supernatural. But then over here, you say, well, I don't even know what evidence would convince me that something would be supernatural. So how can you say, on one hand, I don't know what would convince me of something that was supernatural, and over here you say, well, there's no evidence for it. How can there be? Do you see the conflict that
right.
I'm
So
in there?
let's continue with the courtroom example. The first thing you have to figure out is, was a crime committed?
Mm-hmm.
That's the very first thing. In order to know if a crime was committed, you have to know what the actions were and what the law is,
Yeah.
right? When it comes to the supernatural, we don't know what the actions are. We don't know what it's capable of. And we don't know what the laws surrounding it and how it works are. So we don't know anything about it that is concrete enough to begin to reason about how it works. So that's where the work's got to be done. And there are probably people working on that, trying to
Mm-hmm.
figure out how it works and all that. I mean, You walk into an occult bookstore and there's a lot of books that claim to work. But that's what we have to look for, is
Yeah.
because I don't know what the evidence that would convince me is, because I don't know what the crime is. I don't know if there's even been a crime committed, because I
Mhm.
don't know what the actions were and I don't know what the law is.
Well,
So I can't
and
even tell you.
that's kind of where I was going. It's and you tell me where I'm wrong here, and I'm open to being wrong. It almost sounds like you're in the courtroom analogy. You've got the uh, whether it's a jury member or a member of maybe the defense team or whatnot saying, um, I don't think that there's been a crime, but then again, I don't know what evidence would convince me that a crime took place.
Well, that's what the prosecuting attorney then does, right? They go,
Yeah.
okay, here's the law, or the judge says, here's the law. And the prosecuting attorney shows how the actions were in violation of the law. And so you start with those premises. You don't even get to a courtroom unless, there's reasonable, in some cases, depending on the severity of the crime, you don't even get to a courtroom unless
Mm-hmm.
you can prove that a crime is committed. So it's the first thing you got to do,
Right.
right? That's what a grand jury is all about, is prove there's a crime.
Yeah.
Um, we don't even have that grand jury yet. And so that's kind of what I'm looking for. Prove that there's that, give me something to judge the supernatural on. So if you tell me that the supernatural exists because prayer works, and I show you, 3 good studies that say that works at the same rate as chance, to me, that's evidence against your position that prayer works. But that doesn't necessarily mean all prayer doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
That may
It's
just
like
mean
the
that the
black
way those people,
swan fallacy.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
I can reject the claim that prayer works. I can't counterclaim,
Yeah. And so,
especially with only.
and I guess that's where not with you, not
Mhm.
with you, but just in general. Um, I want to, the question that I guess I would propose to you would be, what I mean, if the supernatural is simply something that um, cannot be empirically explained by uh, natural law or um, what we know takes place in the natural world consistently, and I'm just using a very rough definition.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be a starting point of
Well,
defining what a miracle is or what the supernatural is? Because if
so remember,
yeah,
science is a process, right?
right,
So first you come up with a hypothesis, then you figure out a way to test it, and then you interpret the results of the test. So that's kind of what we have to do with the supernatural, is say, okay, what test can we do? And the simplest test, like I'll pick on spells. The simplest test is to do the spell. If it works, what do you know? Well, did you do the spell correctly? Did you make the pronunciations
yeah,
correctly? Did you wave your hands correctly? What else? And you do all these tests, and eventually you can say that there is no combination of pronunciations and hand waving and whatever other elements that go into the
right.
spell that works.
Now the only
Um,
oh, sorry, go ahead. I
yeah,
don't want to cut you
and
off.
so that's kind of where you're at. And again, if the spell works, then it has to interact with the real world somehow.
No, I agree.
Um, uh, to some degree, but then we have something we can start working with. Once you get that first spell to work, you can go, oh, okay.
Right.
So what happens if? And we can start doing tests, or we can start following on the process. But to the best of my knowledge, we don't even have that beginning starting point for something we would consider supernatural.
But and I guess my follow up would be that, granted, when we talk about you know scientific method, things like that, nature primarily works on processes,
Hmm.
but there are certain things throughout the course of nature that have only happened one time, that there's no way for us to I guess you would say, to redo it or retest it, right? So
Yeah,
like the
I agree.
beginning,
Yeah,
so like the beginning of the universe, or however you
yeah,
define that, like that's
yeah.
only happened once. There's no way that we could ever run another test to recreate that event, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, as far as we know, there's no way. We
as
may not
far
have
as we
sufficient
know, there's no
technology.
way
Yeah.
to do that. So why couldn't we say in the example of a miracle that we don't necessarily, in the same way that we, as far as we know, can't recreate that first or the event of the universe coming into being, why all of a sudden do I need a process, so to speak, to get the ball rolling on miracles? What if that's the only time that specific supernatural event happened?
So then you've got, I mean, the only thing we can say in that case is we don't know how it happened, we don't know why it happened, and we can't test anything. So we don't know. You're left at that answer.
But
Um,
you're not saying okay, but you're saying we still couldn't get to that's a miracle.
right, because it only happened once. So
Right.
you would still, right. It's like, okay,
But do you see where I'm coming from with
yeah,
this?
yeah, I do.
Do you
So
okay.
somebody hits a baseball 5 miles, measured, captured on camera, whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Only happens once. Is that a miracle?
Yeah. Uh, a miracle definitionally is the suspension of natural law, right?
How do you know it wasn't suspended?
Well, I think that's a good question. We could ask the question: is there something here that is a miracle or not?
Yeah. See, now you're on my position, right?
Right.
I don't know.
Well, I would agree. I've never heard of anybody hitting a baseball 5 miles, from anywhere. So uh, it seems like there are some it seems like gravity is not operating the way that it should.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So and you're exactly on my position. I don't know.
Right.
And I think that is the most honest answer to give.
Mm-hmm.
And whether it's social or biological or some combination, I think it's the hardest answer for us as humans to give. We like answers.
Yeah.
We
And we
don't
could
like
and
I
you
don't
could
know.
test you could test the person who hit the home run and say, "All right, has he ever hit a baseball 2 miles or 3 miles or 4
Yeah,
miles?"
I
Right? And
have
if
you
he did,
arguing
then
my
it wouldn't
position now.
necessarily well, if he did, it wouldn't necessarily be a miracle, right? And we know that baseballs get hit all the time.
Again, you're arguing my position.
I don't I don't know how I'm arguing position because I'm saying this miracle could
Well,
be a
you're arguing it's
miracle.
not. You're arguing it's not a miracle. We have a suspension of natural law that has to happen in order to hit a baseball on
Right,
planet
but if
Earth
he did it,
5 miles.
but if he did it during the process, if the process was all right, he has done this before, right? Then
But then it's not a unique event, and that was what we'd
right.
initially set up. It was a
Well,
unique event.
and my point is that you could have a a event like the one I described with the ACA,
Right.
right? You would
Yes.
still say don't know.
Yeah.
Okay. Fair
Yeah.
enough. Well, man, I want to talk more about this because I love talking about
Yeah.
this specific subject, and I want to say thank you so much
Oh,
for
thank
coming
you.
on the show. We might actually have to do some editing. This is an hour and a half conversation, so I might have to break it up into two parts, or I don't know if people want to listen to our conversation that's an hour and a half long, then go for it. I think it was a stimulating conversation for my mind. I greatly
Absolutely.
appreciate it. Love the fact that that we showed people that hey, an atheist and a Christian come together, have a cordial conversation, even if they disagree on just about every single point when it comes to the existence of God. And with that, Jim, I'm gonna go ahead and give you the last word, man. Where do you have a YouTube channel? Where can we check you out? Is there
I'm
any?
only on AXP. Anywhere online where you find Jim Barrows, it's probably me. Um, my last name is fairly unique. My entire life, I've only run into two other people who have it that aren't my family. So it's probably me, especially if it's Jim. Jay Barrows also works, but mostly it's Jim Barrows. I'm on Facebook and occasionally on Twitter. I don't like Twitter as much as Facebook. It's harder to do long-winded things, and I have a tendency to talk too much or type too much, as the case may be. Um, but yeah, I'm only on XP. I have been toying around. I do have a YouTube channel, but there hasn't been on anything on it in 15 years, I think.
Okay.
Uh, and it was mostly some swordplay stuff I was doing. But yeah, I think the key for me to having a conversation like this is leave the ego out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Don't get stuck on identifying yourself with your ideas. Separate yourself from those two. Because in my experience, it's when people base their identity on their beliefs that and get the ego involved that tempers get lost and bad things happen. And I think that's why family conversations are so hard in so many different ways. It's very hard to separate your identity from this person who is disagreeing with you.
Yeah, no doubt.
So,
So,
but yeah,
thank you,
it was fun.
thank you so much, Jim. I had a lot of fun, and I hope that at some point in the future we can do it again.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, take care, Jim.
All right, take care.
All right, well, that was a really awesome conversation. That's the first time that I've ever actually had a face-to-face encounter with Jim. He's a great guy. Really enjoyed the way that we handled each other, the way that the arguments went. I think that you'll find that it was a really good conversation. And thank you once again for tuning in to the Daily Apologist podcast. For more articles or content, you can definitely hit us up at www.thedailyapologist.com. We're on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @daily_apologist. We're on Instagram. We're on Facebook. We're on Pinterest even. Go ahead, check out our information. And if you want to help us create more content, we definitely would humbly accept a donation. You can do that at thedailyapologist.com/donate. And once again, that just goes to show you that even if you disagree with somebody on every single point, you can still be cordial. And the goal of this series is to break down stereotypes. And so far, we are definitely 2 for 2. So thank you to Ethan for last week's conversation, and thank you to Jim for this week's conversation. My name's Dean Meadows. This is the Daily Apologist podcast. And remember, equip yourself to engage culture.